is the question of the Tiananmen Square and what occurred, and if I think it's justified. It depends on what you mean by justified, because if we're talking about how the event is covered or is currently understood, the popular understanding of the event in Western spaces, and the events that actually transcribed, that actually went on, then there's some, let's say, disparities between those two views. If you want to take a deep look into it, then there's a really good reading list that is compiled by the Qiao Collective. I believe that's how it's pronounced, but it's spelled QIAO Collective, and they have a long reading list on the Tiananmen Square, exactly what happened. They use, I think, almost entirely Western sources, so you can take a look at that and see for yourself. But generally, if they were justified, the what's it called? Oh my lord! See, my English fails me sometimes. Sequence of events, that's the term that I was looking for. The sequence of events was as such. There was an occupation by mostly students within the square. They weren't advocating for free, like just some vague aspect of freedom that, as it was painted as. It was an incredibly diverse movement. There are some that were, for example, Maoists and wanted to return to more Mao-like policies. There were some who wanted the Dengist opening up and reforms to go even further than they had. There's some that wanted outright transition to capitalism. There's some that wanted more of a liberal democratic system, but still with a attempted socialist economic policy. It was a very complex movement, number one. Number two, we should not overstate the size of the movement. We got to remember that China's a country of a population of over 1 billion people. I think at the time it was 1.1 billion people. And this movement was no larger than, 70,000 people that were present there? So it really isn't representative of the Chinese people. It is better to say it's more representative of a certain layer of the intelligentsia within Chinese society, particularly within the universities. And that is evident in their demands, which included mostly things that only catered to the intelligentsia, which included political power for intelligentsia, increased pay for those who are part of the intelligentsia, certain access things within universities and whatnot. It was a very, this is the aspect that was really highlighted by Western media as almost like the only part of the movement. That's the part I'm talking about. But yeah, they occupied the square and they were asked to leave, and they held their place. And the people on the square were peaceful. What occurred outside the square, around the square, though, was certain levels of violence. If people are unaware, before any troops were mobilized, before any shots were fired, numerous Chinese soldiers that were just, if you don't know, by the way, in case you're unaware, because in the United States, I don't know if it's the same, but in most third world countries, and China's included in this, it's very normal to see a uniformed soldier on the street. In fact, it's very normal to see them just going out and about.
Previously,
or
it used
they might
to be
be
more
in
common.
charge of a particular place.
Yeah,
like they just
in
keep
the
an eye on
United
a person.
States, if you're essentially if you're in proximity to a military base, you'll see in uniform or military personnel fairly frequently, but it's nowhere near the level of that you would see in a place like Mexico or Honduras, where some are there for security presence. And I think in China at the time, we would see a lot more who were just there in uniform to lend security, more so than just going on their day-to-day operations.
For sure. Exactly. Thank you for much more eloquently being much more eloquent with what I was trying to say. But yeah, exactly that. And what happened outside the square before any bullets were even fired or any violence took place was severe violence against those soldiers that were present. Most of them were unarmed, by the way. Several were burnt alive, even. And this was reported by Western media. And that's when the events were transcribed. On the square itself, no massacre took place. What happened around the square, though, is that's where the violence took place. It's maybe a pedantic point, but that's why I don't like the term, for example, Tiananmen Square massacre. It's a bit incorrect. And by the way, the Western media sources, if you go back and look at the BBC reporting and whatnot, you'll see. In fact, there's even the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. There was a WikiLeaks documents that show that they even admit that there was no American officials, which were in at the square and also reported to the embassy in Beijing, the American embassy, that there was no massacre that took place on the square itself. But yeah, So to say if it was justified or not, let me invert the question. Because by the way, if you didn't know, the movement, which is this is very well documented, all the student leaders and all the leaders of it, completely, the ones that were highlighted by the US, by the way, all of them got direct diplomatic and monetary financial support from the United States and associated groups that the United States supported. And you can see that by the fact that all of the people who were in charge of the movement, a few of them were imprisoned for several years and let go, like 2-3 years sentences and then let go. After which they immigrated to the US, or they just directly immigrated after the protest ended to the US, and all of them are in highly lucrative financial sectors. All of them live their lives in the US right now. What I'm trying to get at is that is a very interesting point, and I'd like to turn that back to the audience. Imagine if in the United States there were like protests that occurred, massive protests that occurred, which were directly supported by Chinese money, that had people that were directly in contact with Chinese officials, that when the movement then fails, by the way, after they assault numerous officials and personnel, burning some alive even, and then afterwards they leave to China, where they end up being in very lucrative positions, wouldn't you assume, maybe China had some part in this movement? And by the way, I don't mean the entire Tiananmen Square movement. There are certain sectors of that movement that did have genuine grievances. That's not what I'm trying. I'm not trying to claim that China is perfect. It never was and never is. Even currently, it isn't. But the point I'm trying to get at is the American perception or the Western media perspective on the Tiananmen Square movement, and the small sector of it that they decided to highlight is suspect. But there are other issues that were protests at the time. For example, the dismantling of the Iron Rice Bowl was something that was discussed, especially by the Mao sectors of the movement that existed in the square at the time. That is a very fair criticism to be made. There are some criticisms that are made of corruption, particularly within universities, but also of the government. Those are also fair criticisms to be made. But what I find interesting is that the United States and official support never highlighted those grievances that directly affected people's livelihoods, employment, access to education where they are. Instead, decided to highlight very vague platitudes of democracy, freedom. That's kind of my hope of that. My hope is that you understand my perspective. If you really are interested in this, by the way, I strongly suggest people do the reading if they're interested to see what my perspective personally would be in more detail. Check out that Chow Collective, QIAU Collective reading list. You'll find it on Google if you look it up. As for the other questions on China, I think there in the AMA there are further questions on China. China later.
We'll get a little bit later there. I think that was a pretty extensive answer to the question there. Let's move up to and just to be fair there, a lot of the criticisms there, similar, and not to get into an argument or whatever, but they're just about any large protest movement, whether it's happening in Hong Kong, whether it's happening in Russia, whether it's happening in the United States, will have foreign backers and agitators attached to it. It's just too profitable not to do. It's not unique to the situation. I think that your claims are most likely accurate, and the CIA was probably involved. But just about every place where power is shifting, foreign agitators will be in there trying to get a piece of the pie.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's go to Chief Potleaf.